Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast, Mr. Schnapf. It's a pleasure to have you back on the show. Come back for round two. I'm happy. That means you like me, or at least you're tolerating me for a little bit. But please let everybody know what's been going on. You've had a lot going on. We got the JFK record recent release. We had your guys' press conference as well, too. And then now we have a new act going out there. So you can pick any one of the three we can talk about because we're going to talk about them all.
Okay, well, thank you for having me back on. Those of us of a certain generation are thrilled that you're picking up the mantle, that you're becoming one of the leading voices of your generation to pick up the mantle and continue to pursue this issue because we need the way things are going right now. It looks like we may need another generation before we get all the answers. So the president issued his executive order on December 15th, 2022, releasing some records. The talking points were that there were roughly 14,000 records that were released. Many of the releases are just records that were already released, and now they're in less redacted form. There's fewer redactions. There may be a couple names that are now available that weren't available before. There may be, like with the there's this 1962 memo that Arthur Schlesinger wrote to President Kennedy about discussing possible ways of reorganizing the CIA, and they basically unredacted one sentence. So the order provides that the agencies, for the 4,000 records that are in the collection that still have redactions, that the agencies have until May 30th to work out understandings with the National Archives as to whether these 4,000 records are to be released in full. And if the National Archives can't reach agreement with the agencies, then it gets punted up to the president once again, and the president has a decision to make by June 30th as to whether to certify. Quite frankly, after 60 years, I'm not sure what an additional 6 months are going to do. If the agencies were not comfortable in December about releasing records in full, what's going to happen after 6 more months? Basically, what could potentially happen for some records is that people are going to have died. And this is the irreparable harm that is happening to the research community. This is not simply just releasing a record in full so people can read it. It's when the records are released in full, then researchers can follow up. For example, a memo that was released in full in December we call the Heath memo. It was written by this guy, Heath, Donald Heath Jr., who had been tasked by the CIA. He was one of the people at the CIA who worked with the Miami station. The weekend of the assassination, the Miami station was tasked with interviewing Cuban exiles and also people that may be supporters of Castro to find out if the assassination, if any of them were involved in the assassination. We had known about this memo in the past, but the names had been redacted. Well, Mr. Heath died, I think, last year or the year before. So had we known about this in 2017, researchers could have asked him lots of questions, but he's dead. So, okay, now we know his name, but there's no further research we can do. And this is the game they're playing. The FBI and the CIA are using a 100-year rule. If they can't determine if the person is dead, they then use a 100-year rule, saying that they can hold back the names of of individuals. Um, so you know,
Well, do you think that's still, I mean, you got to think about the generation that's going to, I mean, we just had David Lifton pass away, Richard Belzer as well, too. So you got a bunch of people, like, I mean, obviously there's not a lot of people around from the JFK assassination. I think Blakey's still alive, Cyril Weck's still alive. Like, there's some first generation researchers. I think Josiah Thompson, a few other names are still alive. But I mean, they keep delaying the documents. I mean, the people that invested their whole entire life into this to try and find answers and try and find a conclusion because they didn't agree with the official story, they're not going to be around 100 years, So it's my generation. I mean, do you think it's delayed progress because there's intelligence documents or things of that sort? Because I don't know what they're labeling intelligence, man. I've seen the word national security get thrown around a little bit too much to the point where anything that they would be using, I think Thunheim says that if it's a name of someone that's involved that's still alive, they can keep it redacted. And he said even in the JFK case, that's rarely the case. But intelligence operations that they could still be using today. But when I spoke to David Montague from the ARRB, I asked him about Lee Harvey Oswald's Clinton incident, if you've ever heard of that, about the mental institution. He said he couldn't talk about it. Now, that was a file specifically from his thing that he requested for that. That's his area. And it's not on the Mary Farrell site. There's no other lead in. It's just the letter. So I go, are you claiming that as an intelligence thing? Or is that just what you're late? Or is it sensitive info? Because but Lee Harvey Oswald's dead. So I don't see the whole, you know what I'm saying? Like there's a really weird line where it's like, what are you defining as national security and what are you defining as like sensitive information? And I feel like at that point, when it's like an open door policy, you could just label anything that you could have a memo that could be about JM Wave or whatever you want, and just say national security issue. It could be, I got a Coke from, the day the president got shot, and then national security. It's like, that's a dangerous thing.
well, there's a couple things going on. First of all, what we've seen the last couple months is that, it's driven home is that we have a problem with overclassification in this country to begin with. I mean, the issues with President Biden, President Trump, um, you know, um, there's this instinct to overclassify. Mike Pompeo was on a podcast last week, and at the very end, the interviewer asked him about the JFK records. And his first reaction was, there's nothing there to begin with, what's left. I've seen the documents. And then he says, and there are, we have to protect, if we've made promises to people that were informants, and particularly if they're overseas, they could be alive, or if they're not alive, their families could be affected. And then he then said that we're still possibly using sources and methods from the 60s. And then he went on further and said the way the assassination records are defined, if there was a hearing this week, that would become an assassination record, so they don't, and when the CIA gave its press release on December 15th to the selected number of reporters with the CIA's talking points, they made it very clear, they pointed out that whatever records are left, they're not about the assassination. And so it's like they're trying to relitigate the decision that these documents were even assassination records. Now, this is about, all we've been talking about so far is about the records in the collection. But what's even more important are the records that are not in the collection. And that's a big part of our lawsuit, the Mary Farrell lawsuit, is to force, we know that when the ARB went out of business, they had outstanding search requests that were, tendered to various agencies. And as far as we know, the National Archives has not followed up, even though the National Archives has said when they moved the ARB regulations from the part of the federal regulations, the Code of the Federal Register, from where the ARB's regulations had been, they moved them over into the National Archives Part 36 regs. Why would they do that? They said that they were the successor in function in the Federal Register notice in announcing they were moving the regs. So they said they were the successor in function, and yet they haven't done anything that the ARB was doing. They've been sitting back passively. People have asked them, have told, so the National Archives General Counsel has told researchers, if you are aware of assassination records that are not in the collection, please let us know. So people have let the archives know, and they haven't done anything except in one case with Bill Kelly, when one of the Secret Service agents had some documents in his home, and they made him turn them over. But except for that one case, they haven't done anything. So even if,
but do you think it's because people don't trust the archives? I've met a couple of researchers that just don't trust the archives. It was a question I asked Thomas Samaluk when he was on here, if he trusted the archives. Because, I mean, reclassification is a thing. And I feel like if it's a government institution, whether it's history or not, I mean, what power does the FBI, the CIA have to come in and maybe something was released that they didn't want released? I've seen plenty of those documents. So, I mean, that makes a lot of sense when it comes to like the HSCA looking through documents, the ARRB looking through documents. What did you send them? We have to make sure we check all the documents, make sure we're not giving you like sensitive information. And so, I mean, is that a possibility that maybe something got into the archives and it happened to be in some person's home and they needed it reclassified?
well, when the
I'm not trying to be really conspiracy here, but
there's a complicated issue. So presidents issue, there's a standing executive order about classifying records, and Eisenhower issued it, then Nixon revised it, then Reagan revised it, Clinton revised it, Obama revised it, and Trump revised it. When Reagan revised it, he allowed agencies to reclassify records. So Reagan comes into power in 1980, which is post HSCA. It's possible, and when the Records Act was passed, Clinton had not yet revised the executive order. So it's very possible that agencies were reclassifying records during the period of time that the act went into effect, before Clinton's 1995 order that prevented reclassification. You also have people whose jobs it is to handle classified records, and they have a tendency of, that's the only thing they think about, and they tend to be very conservative because they don't want to get in trouble. But we know the ARB asked for records that were not in the collection. They identified them as potential assassination records. And the ARB went out of business. The ARB went out of business, but their work wasn't done. And the problem is that the National Archives has not picked up that mantle. Now, the act, one of the objectives of the act was to create an enforceable, independent body, because there was no trust that the government was going to, release the rest of the records. So yes, there are people that we know from my lawsuit asking for the underlying documents to the Trump decisions, that the National Archives initially objected to the grounds that were for postponement that were asserted by the FBI and the CIA. But the National Archives catered to the pressure of the executive branch, and eventually did a 180 and actually sent a letter that the way the process was set up, and this is all extra, this process that was developed under the Trump administration is not provided for in the statute. They basically have the archives making a recommendation to the president to postpone. Nothing in the statute says that. It just says that the archives and the NARA are the archives and the agencies are supposed to consult, and then the president makes a decision. So they basically, you can see that the archives was basically forced to fall on its shield. They're being good bureaucrats. They basically were, a letter recommending postponement was prepared for the archives by the National Security Council. That's what my lawsuit shows. And they went through like 13 drafts. And then eventually the archivist signs the letter. And then the president uses that as the basis for postponing the records. So yes, there's no independent agency right now to vet these records. And so if the CIA and the FBI want to postpone records, they basically appeal to the NSC, which tells the president, what to do. And then the NSC turns around and writes a letter for the archivist to sign.
So besides having like independent researchers that are just filing FOIA requests and waiting years upon years upon years to get information, I mean, even independent researchers, even Jefferson Morley or other people that are filing lawsuits like yourself against either the archives or wherever you're going to file a lawsuit against to maybe get some records released. What discourse or recourse do you really have when it comes to, I mean, they could just keep you going for 10, 15 years, 20 years. I mean, this could be just a problem that we never see the light of day on until my grandkids or great grandkids start to see, archival records. I mean, that goes to a private organization to do so. And then who selects that private organization? I would think it would be a team of researchers, people that have put the most amount of work into trying to get real documents released for the public to be able to see. Because I think when I started out, and probably anybody listening, they hear the National Archives, you go, that's a historical thing. So they obviously want the historical documents. Well, not if they're working and postponing and submitting requests to postpone information. I mean, this is a historical thing right here.
Well, I want to say that I believe the archives is doing all it can to get the records released, but their hands are tied right now because they don't have the power, or at least they're saying in public, like Bosanko, who is the chief operating officer of the archives, was interviewed by Russ Baker last month, and he basically said if researchers are unhappy about records being postponed, they should pursue the CIA and the FBI. He says that our mission is not about searching for records. We're an archival organization. And yet they said that the successor in function to the ARB, which his job was to not only search for records, but determine if they should be disclosed. So, the final report of the ARB did make a recommendation to Congress. And one of the recommendations was either to create a new body, a public-private body, or to have Congress amend the law to give express powers to the National Archives. That was never followed up. And having to use FOIA, the JFK Act was passed because FOIA was ineffective in getting their records released. There are exemptions under FOIA that the agencies have been using successfully. There's the law enforcement exception. There's the deliberative process exemption, where you can't get documents of the agencies as part of the decision-making process. National security grounds. The JFK Act was very powerful. I mean, Congress said in the legislative history that the JFK Act is a unique solution to the problem of government secrecy, and that the FOIA and the way the national security orders were being implemented were not. The act was necessary because those two mechanisms were being used in a way to prevent the release of the records. So and the National Archives told one researcher, I think it was Dan Alcorn. Dan Alcorn said he believed that certain records in the mid-teens, he wrote a letter to the National Archives and said that he believed certain records were assassination records. And the National Archives wrote back and said, we think you should use FOIA for these records. That's not the way it's supposed to work. If they're assassination records, they're supposed to be released under the JFK Act. You don't go to FOIA because FOIA is ineffective. And the other problem is, if you submit a request to the National Archives under FOIA, let's say they do release a record to you. Well, that record is not put into the JFK collection unless you decide to do it. I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, the individual people get to hold their records. It doesn't get, the next step isn't done. We've released this assassination record to you, and now we're going to put it in the collection. But the big problem is there are records. We have to get the message out that even if on June 30th, President Biden released all of the remaining 4,000 records in complete unredacted form, the job is not finished. There are records out there that are not in the collection that are probably the most important ones. So Heath mentioned in his memo that they spent several months running down, whether the exiles were involved in the assassination. And they had these status reports that were prepared each month, situation reports, they were called. And there were monthly situation reports. He writes in his memo, he saw them in 1973 in some CIA officer's desk. Where are they? We don't even know if they exist. If they exist, they haven't been put in the collection. So there's still records out there, and they're potentially the more important records than the ones that are in the collection now. The ones in the collection now are, from 1998 or before. And we've learned a lot more since then. There's plenty of records involving Mexico City that are not in the collection. Some have been destroyed. And that's the other problem. There's been no enforcement against any of the agencies that have destroyed records, like the Secret Service, for example. So what does the Secret Service do? Last year they destroyed emails about the January 6th because there's no downside to doing this. You don't get punished. The Office of Naval Intelligence refused to sign the Declaration of Compliance under the JFK Act. They said they were going to use the Executive National Security Order. Did anyone ever go after them? No. So if people aren't going to get punished for not complying with the law, then they're going to just continue not comply with the law.
How do you create what would be a punishment? How do you implement a punishment for people to, I guess, either have legal recourse for it or, at least put them up to a higher standard to understand the dangers of destruction of documents, which we know is happening or happened. But
what happened to Edward Snowden, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are people that have gone to jail for either taking home records or destroying them. And
do you think this is bigger than JFK and all that type of stuff, though? I feel like, okay, because that's what I'm getting like hints of. I'm like, this can't just be about some event 60 years ago. This is like going to open up the door to the era of like real secrecy within the government when it comes to what the hell are you guys up to? I mean, if I was going to say a deep state, and I know people laugh at the term, but honestly, I've been envisioning the freaking intelligence agencies because I have no clue what they are doing. I mean, I looked through the church committee report and I'm reading through half of the stuff and I'll tell a friend about it and they'll be like, oh, no, the CIA is not on campus. I'm like, they were, and they might still be from stories I've heard from people. And then the NSA, I have no clue what their job is at all because they have documents on the assassination. They got documents on the FBI. They got documents on the CIA. And it's just like, what the hell is going on inside of our government a little bit? And I think when you live in that area or that kind of like echo chamber a little bit too long, you start kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say paranoia, but you start kind of not knowing when you're doing bad because now it's just became normal.
so, there are those of us who were a little too young to participate in the church committee process. Maybe like we were in college, we were not at law school, we weren't in the law school yet. There are a lot of people that we missed about by 5 years being able to participate in that process. So those of us though that went through that process believe that we are at another critical point in this country's history. That we are in essence classified information has become a really important issue here. And unless it gets subsumed by the balloons. But the classified information, the problem of overclassification has once again been picked up by the media. And your generation now has a chance to really do something here because, yes, so in the 70s, there was a lot of angst that developed when it was learned that the NSA had a program that searched for words in every overseas telephone call. If your conversation had a certain word in it, your conversation was automatically recorded. So basically, when the conversation was going up and down through the satellites, they were monitoring every international phone call, and they came up with certain code words that could be potentially trigger national security grounds. So if you sent that word, your phone conversation was recorded and reviewed. So people got all upset by that, and they stopped that program. But they were doing the same thing with your cell phones and the internet. They're still spying on you, right? So they continually they hide behind this national security grounds, and they keep expanding what constitutes national security, so that that they can continue to do what would be perceived to be illegal activity under the Constitution. But nobody wants to be the person that says, don't do this. And it turns out a terrorist is then able to come in and cause a massive, threat. So everyone is over conservative, and it's the opposite of criminal law. In criminal law, you say if it's better to have 9 people out of 10 get away with murder than to have one person improperly convicted, which we're having that anyway. But it's a complete reverse when it comes to national security. I mean, 2001 really changed. People don't appreciate how much the world changed and our country changed after 9/11. We became a police state, and
we labeled Islam in such a way that all Muslims and anybody that comes from that certain area gets labeled as a terrorist, basically, in a sense.
Well, yeah, that too. But I mean, like you guys your generation's completely comfortable having cameras on every corner, monitoring everything you do.
When I read mail intercepts and then like wiretapping congressmen and like the church committee report, I'm like, well, fuck. I was like, we got a cell phone. Like they do. But that's the thing, is that like we understand and we accept it. That's all I want. I don't need them to tear up, stop their programs and spying them. All I say is that define the terms. If you're going to spy on me, let the people know that you're going to be using the cell phone to do so because you're tracking terrorists.
But
If
then their
people
answer
don't,
is, we can't let the terrorists know how we're going to be tracking them.
I mean, at this point, when I look at their intelligence operations, I feel like if you just were open, like if people like their names getting redacted out of documents, I mean, as a person, if they say, hey, you're going to be a part of this covert operation, and then they explain it to you, and then you go, I don't know if I want to be a part of that. Don't worry, your name's going to be blacked out. All right, right on. Then it's not something you probably should be doing morally. So you should just print the person's name. That's on them. In my opinion, from what I've learned, MK Ultra, Operation Mockingbird, all these types of things where names are redacted out, I go, that's not good. Anybody reading that you can justify to yourself that, like, okay, that's not good at all. But if your name's not in it, then there's no harm because you're never going to be found out until long after you're gone. So, I mean, that's a real danger.
Right, but they're arguing that either. I mean, it's hard for me to believe. I'll take Mike Pompeo on his word, but the idea that we're still using methods and sources and methods from the 1960s is actually kind of scary. But let's assume that that's correct, okay? So they're arguing that there may be an informant that worked for the Mexican government or the Cuban government, and if somehow their name came out, the current government would prosecute the family. Some of this is, there was that one document about the monitoring you're doing in Mexico City. And the reason the document was being withheld was because the CIA was concerned that if it got out that the Mexican president had been cooperating with us, it would cause the collapse of his government. But the man hasn't been in power since 1970. And yet they held that back for all these years. I mean, this is absurd. And then they have the other document they released in 2017 that was discussing activities Oswald was doing in Japan, but we already knew about that. The reason they held a record back was because the information was gathered by a listening station on Australia. And we had made a promise to the Australian government at their request that we would not disclose that we had a listening station on their soil. Meanwhile, the CIA is holding this back while there's a TV show called Pine Gap, #1 rated show in Australia, about our listening station on Australia. So, we need someone that's completely independent, to vet these requests. And at least the ARB, in the first couple of years of the ARB, it was really independent. The last year, it was under so much pressure to get its mission done that it started taking the position that if we fight the agencies, we're going to end up releasing less documents. So let's just cut a deal with them to maximize the amount of documents that can be released. But this is the problem when you have a sunsetted agency or commission. We need a permanent commission or a body constituted by private individuals unrelated to the government to continue this mission until we are satisfied that every document is released. And it should be it's no sunset. And that gets us to the bill now. So we have David Schweikert, a representative Republican congressman from Arizona, wrote a bill on January of this year called the Justice for Kennedy Act. I think it's HR 637. He sits on the Ways and Means Committee, but this bill was referred to both the Ways and Means Committee. It was McCarthy, the leader of the House, assigned this bill to the Ways and Means Committee, but also the Homeland, the National Security, the Oversight Committee, the Judiciary Committee, the Intelligence Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and of course the Ways and Means Committee. So now these committees have this bill, and it's up to them to decide whether they're going to hold hearings on it or take any action on it. The bill essentially provides that upon its enactment, all assassination records will be released within 30 days. And it specifically overrides the conditions that allow agencies to postpone records. So sections 5 and 6 of the JFK Act provide that, for if there's identifiable harm to national security, law enforcement, then the records may be postponed if the president certifies that the harm is of such gravity that it outweighs the public interest. That's all gone under this bill. There's no more excuse for postponing records. Number 2, really important, it eliminates the tax exemption so that we can get Oswald's tax records to see if he actually was getting paid by somebody other than his employer. 3,
you mean employers?
Employers, yeah. 3, it overrides the deed of gifts exemption. So the Manchester tapes of recorded interviews of Jackie and Kennedy and Robert Kennedy would now become available. Any deed of gift that is being used to hold back the RFK records that are in the JFK library that haven't been released yet, all those deed of gifts, their conditions would be just overruled by statute. So this is a really good start. It doesn't provide for this creation of this independent body. So I'm going to be contacting their office this week, congratulating them for taking this big step, and then I'm going to have some suggestions for further, for further refinements of the act. But the next step is to get the chairs of these committees to hold a hearing and move these bills through the committee process. So they don't get to the floor of the Congress to be voted on until the committee releases the bills, and they don't release the bills usually until there's a hearing. So we got to get one of these committees. Now, unfortunately, the way the process is, if he's a member, Schweikert's a member of the Ways and Means Committee. So when a member proposes a bill, it tends to get more attention than if a bill is given to the committee that was sponsored by a member who was not in the committee. So what we need to do is get sponsors, committee members to sponsor the bill, co-sponsor it, so then it would have greater chance of being considered. But for your listeners, viewers, the next step is I would urge all of you to find out if any of your representatives sit on one of those committees. Again, it's the House Oversight Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, the House Intelligence Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, and the Foreign Affairs Committee. So you can just look up those committees online under the House of Representatives. First, find out who your representative is, in case you don't know. And then see if, or you can go to your representative's bio and see what committees your representative sits on. But if your representative sits on any of those committees, then you should write the representative a note asking him or her to ask the chair to hold a hearing on the Justice for Kennedy bill, which is 637, I believe. That's one way to get some action. But we have a bill now that actually can result in, it will at least release the remaining 4,000 records. And depending on the final version, I would like to see some enforcement mechanism in there so that private individuals can actually enforce the act. The ARB was viewed as the enforcement mechanism when the bill was passed, but the ARB's gone now. Unless Congress creates a new review board or some body that becomes enforcement, then many statutes can be enforced by citizens.
The ARB should have had full capability to stay enacted until all the documents were released. I mean, that's their goal. I know it's reviewing the documents to see what could be released, but
well, they're subject to appropriations, and they were told. So they made yearly reports to Congress, and unfortunately, there was a hearing in I think the end of sometime in maybe the fall of '97 or something, and they were asked. Well, I don't know what occurred first. I believe that Judge Sondheim was told that we're not going to get funded after '98. So I don't know if his testimony was given with that in mind, but he did say he thought they were going to be able to complete their work by the end of fiscal year '98. So,
well, at the last minute, they got Hostie's notes, some of the most important
a lot of
information
stuff
we got.
came at the end, and I mean, they were scrambling the last year to get the work done, and the work is not completed. I mean, they entered into a three-way memorandum of understanding with the CIA and the National Archives for the CIA to do certain transmit certain documents to the National Archives in the following years. I don't know if they've completed all those tasks. I've been asking researchers, and a lot of people don't even know about this MOU. There was one court decision that denied the right of a private party to enforce the MOU. So it's something that, is enforced, has to be enforced through the government. And then we have Judge Sondheim telling us that, when Walter Sheridan took his documents after the ARB asked for Walter Sheridan's documents, they deemed them the assassination records. He went up to the JFK library. I think I told your listeners this last time, just to remind them. He took the documents from the JFK library and brought them to NBC. And then NBC refused to turn them over. The ARB was so upset about this, they actually prepared a subpoena. You can see it on the electronic files of the ARB on the Mary Farrell site. And the Department of Justice refused to serve them. So that's where a political decision was made not to serve a subpoena on NBC because it didn't look good. But if a private party had been able to do that, that would not have held them back. But this is, again, as long as decisions are being made influenced by politics, which the way the current system is, it's undermining the goals of the act. And in fact, it's doing an end run. Congress wanted an independent process that was free of political influence, and Congress simply hasn't stepped up. And that's why we're trying to get a hearing, because Congress needs to be made aware. We need to have testimony on the record that the process that Congress set up in '92, it's now as long from the time the act was passed as when the act was passed from the assassination. So the act was passed roughly 30 years after the assassination. And it's now been 30 years since the act was passed. So, and when Congress passed the bill, they were concerned that because under the current system that was set up, no records would be released until 2029. Well, it's 2023 now. And in 1992, I can assure you that 2023 or 2029 reviewed the same way. That was a long time off. And now we're at 2023. And at the pace we're going, if they keep getting these yearly postponements, they're basically waiting for everybody to die.
Well, 2100s when they got Jackie Kennedy's dress locked up. So it's not crazy to think that they just keep postponing it until, everyone's really, really gone.
Yeah. And what the idea is because no further research can be done if the people are all dead. This is not about simply reading documents and making conclusions. You have to be able to talk to the people. And that's the thing that people are missing. It's not just what does a document say? Okay, historians and researchers are going to look at the document and they're going to want to talk to the principals or the people that are mentioned in the documents. And each year we are losing people. The people that were of adult age in 1963 are maybe, all the senior management people are dead. So the people that were in their 30s, that were middle management at that point, are now in their 90s. Or late 80s. And the next 5 years, we're going to probably lose almost all the witnesses, if you think about it, just on actuarial basis. There'll be very few people alive in another 5 years that are direct witnesses to either conversations, observations, or decision-making. So this is like an urgent matter. This is irreparable harm is going to be created if the government is allowed to continue to push us down the road, because they're basically waiting for everybody to die. They released Heath's name after he died. There's a lot of things we could have asked Heath in 2017 had his name been released, but they waited till he was dead, and then they unredacted his name.
I just hope people who are alive that experience it, they write a journal or they keep a log or something. They're not going to be able to think of every question a researcher is going to be able to ask, but at least they can give some cliff notes and maybe some important details that stick out in their mind. I mean, I think it was even with Tom Samoluk when he talked about Richard Case Nagel and trying to find this trunk and things of that sort. They say they couldn't find the trunk he was describing, but it was still, he found some documents and some things. So I'm like, look, even if you don't get the exact thing that you're thinking about asking, if someone could just record themselves. I mean, there's a couple times we've seen articles now of someone who witnessed the assassination or who was a little child and witnessed the assassination, and they're like 60 something or 70 something. I'm just like, where did this person come from? How did you find this person? Or why are people waiting now to speak out as well too, which is interesting. I mean, if we're waiting
so there is a line of thinking. Some people believe that if they share what they know with their children, that they're going to put their children at risk. And so they rather take the information to the grave with them rather than expose their children to possible.
It's their kids' fault, not their problem. Why do they care? I'm kidding.
But I mean, so there are people that genuinely are nervous about, if you know something, let's say it's about the mafia. Well, if you know something, you're now at risk. So, or if the government, I mean, people have died, right? So mysterious deaths. So
Jim
that thing. The other thing is, when you're getting to now at the age of 90, how good is your memory? And the idea that you can interview children about things their parents said, okay, that is an acceptable form of research, but you don't know if you're 10 years old when your dad tells you something, your mother tells you something about what they saw,
Well, Roger Craig's son talks about it a little bit. Steve Cameron's interviewed him about
again, how much, first of all, how much did they actually process when their parent told them? And then, if what they told them scared them, the human memory is very fragile. In fact, every time you pull a memory out,
it changes it.
It changes it. Right. So, and then it gets poisoned by things you hear. I have a diary from high school. So I did this experiment. I had a diary from high school, and I will then, like, one day I was speeding 100 miles an hour down this road, and we hit this wooden bridge, like a turtleback bridge, and went flying through the air. So I know who was in the car with me. And so I'm in touch with my high school friends. And so I asked them what their memories were of that event. And they varied. Now, obviously, I wrote down my perception of what happens. Everyone has a little different piece. But the point is that I have in my handwriting an event that occurred on a certain day in a certain year. And yet my friends, my three other friends who were in the car with me, have different recollections. So it just shows you how human memory is different. But so it's not only, so if you're having, it's like that telephone game. I don't know if you guys still play that when you were in school. Someone tells something at the one end of the class and then they have to whisper it all. Okay. So first you have the parents telling the kids something. And then so decades later, now the kid is telling you what the parents said. So although it's just you don't know how much of what they're telling you is true, or how much the recollection is accurate. But if it's, it would be great to have an oral history. I tried to get my dad forever. My dad was head of RCA recording studios. He used to record Elvis. And I wanted him to like put down and, I said, I'll do everything. I'll tape it for you. I'll transcribe it for you. He didn't want to do it. There are people that just don't want, to put stuff down in, but this, you would think as part of history, they would want to, but
there's like a name in one of the 22 release, and I don't know what to do with this document. I've sent it to Jim. I've sent it to a bunch of people. It talked about a lady at the Central Intelligence Agency heard a bunch of agents talking about Kennedy needs to be dealt with within the next 5 years. And then she goes into an Army medical facility to receive a shot or polio inoculation. And then as she's receiving the shot, she says that this shot will make her forget everything. And then she didn't remember until like very recently before she gave that statement, like 10 years later. I have no idea what to do with that document, but that was in the most recent release where I can't explain it. I can't justify it. It's just something I throw out there and I go, who the hell's the name? Are they still alive? If they're still alive, I'd like to know who. I hope they come forward, but I mean, you also sign confidentiality agreements or whatever you have to do where you can't speak about things. So at this point, I feel like you just got to say it. You got to just go out there and do it.
If a person is patriotic, when you're 90 years old, what is the government possibly, if you signed the confidentiality agreement, what could they do? Well, they could revoke your pension, or they could put you in jail, or try to.
You only got a couple good years left.
Well, but the pension is a problem, right? I mean, if you're on a government pension, I mean, there's a guy in Texas that was the last person to handle the rifle before it was given to the FBI. He was local Dallas FBI. He was in it. He talks to high school ROTC people, and but he won't talk to any researchers about the rifle. He keeps it to himself. Now, if he was truly a patriotic man, he would tell us what the condition of the rifle was. He allegedly told, when he was substitute teaching, he allegedly told some people at a high school, at a teachers convention, that the rifle was dirty. Otherwise, it wasn't shot. But he won't go on the record. And, are you being patriotic by like not letting the American people know that your president was killed by a conspiracy? Or are you being patriotic in letting the American public know what really happened in their history?
What's his name?
I'll tell you offline.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't want to.
I mean, I get it, because a lot of researchers, like I said, I mean, and we could talk about this because this was the question I wanted to ask you about the conference you did with Thunheim. That one guy that just got up and just started screaming about Israeli and all that. I never knew that was real until I had one person on here that just went deep into that. And I was like, did I just come across something? It's like the Jack Ruby didn't shoot Oswald thing. I don't know how people get there. I mean, I've seen some, like, I like the page on accident on Facebook. I was like, oh, it's a JFK page. I click it. And then like the first post was, how can you tell me this man looks exactly like this man? And it's Jack Ruby. And I'm like, nope, I'm going to unfollow that and just walk away.
Well, again, like Tink Thompson said this, in the early days, all the researchers kind of was a small group and everyone was working together. And now people have their pet theories, and there are some people whose reputation is just that they have a theory, right? And so their whole self-worth is all wrapped up into a theory. A lot of people approach the assassination with a bias. They have a theory and they start looking for information to confirm that belief, as opposed to going honestly looking at it from a objective, open standpoint. I mean, I don't know who killed the president. I have theories, and I am still ambivalent on, a frontal shot. I think there was a frontal shot, but I'm willing to see if I get information that tells me definitively that this is a certain, this particular fact is a non-fact, then I will agree with that. But I don't go into the research looking for a particular confirmation.
I just
Um,
like what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to kind of sort it out now because you hear so many different theories. Is like there's the theory even with Trafficante while he's in Castro's prison, that Jack Ruby visited him, and a lot of people agree with that. I agree with it too. But the source that it comes from is from Wilson Hughes, whatever his name was, that was in the prison, the reporter. Now, the part that verifies it instead of it just coming from the lips of one person is that he went to the FBI after Jack Ruby shot Oswald, and he said to the FBI that's the guy that visited Castro, and then the committee found that later that yes, Ruby did go to Havana in the exact year that that guy said he saw him there, and there would be no possible way unless he knew Ruby. So then that becomes more reasonable and more verified and more true. And then even I think last time me and you talked, we talked about Hoover, and we said it was probably more likely Hoover bet at the track and the mob owned the track. That's why I never acknowledged them. Well, I looked a little bit deeper into that, and it's from Jack Anderson, if you know who he is. That was before Anthony Summers. Look, he says he was spying and looking through Hoover's trash and all this. And look, I mean, at that point, I'm like, all right, it's just one guy saying this. But I'm trying to find it on my phone. He got so detailed in one description of the relationship.
I think there are multiple lines of evidence um, suggesting that Ruby was doing gun running. He was in Cuba as when Trafficante was in jail. Also, that the FBI had considered asked him to become an informant. I think there's multiple lines of evidence. I think there's multiple lines of evidence on this allegation about Hoover. And it kind of fits into the why Hoover suddenly called off the troops when they started sniffing around Marcello. But um, uh, you know, unfortunately, certain leads were not pursued, and even Sam Stern of the Warren Commission said had they known about uh, the the Castro assassination attempts, that they would have focused in a different direction. And he said, I think in the 90s, he said that he was less certain about the conclusions now than he was in the 60s. And
Even Blakey's like that too. Blakey used to talk about the Warren Commission doing a great job, and then now he feels like the CIA left them out on some documents. I mean, slowly over time, they're starting to change their opinions on things because either researchers have done independent work of that sort, but also like it's trying to find like the clouded message. Like the thing I wanted to read you about Mr. Anderson on Mr. Cavet's show. He said on like television, and he was talking about J. Edgar Hoover and his close associate Clyde Tolson, who is 70. He said Hoover's at 76 is more durable than Tolson. Tolson is sort of totters around, and the two of them have sort of outlived all their friends, and as a result, they only have each other. So right then, that's not relationship wise. It seems like okay, it's a couple old guys, friends. This is when I said it gets like really specific. He goes, my correspondents tell me that as he follows them, they spend, well, every night they alternate. One night they'll go to Hoover's home for dinner, and the next night they go to Tolson's apartment for dinner. Every morning, Hoover drives by and picks up Tulsi. He doesn't go by the front door, though. He sneaks around the back of the apartment building in his bulletproof limousine, picks up Tolson, drops him off at night. They eat every day at the Rib Room in the Mayflower Hotel, where Hoover has cottage cheese and grapefruit salad, and where Tolson has cream chicken soup except on Tuesdays. On Tuesdays, he eats bean soup with ketchup poured in it. I go, that's so damn specific that I take that. On top of all the pictures, on top of all the evidence, on top of all that, I accept that a little bit more than just coming from the word of mouth of one person because it's so specific and like ketchup poured into bean soup. I mean, I don't know a whole lot of people that do something like that. And this is the first time I've ever heard of it, or you had to be really creative to think about that. But it's like when people say you can't trust witness testimonies, you can't trust that. I'm like, well, you're getting a lot of information from researchers that heard something from a person like you got, oh God, Mr. Law, his whole entire interview process with Seibert and O'Neill and all these agents, and he has it recorded. Oh, well, you're hearing it from him, and then you're doing this, and then he goes and talks about it. And then people say you can't accept that because he's hearing it.
It's not what they're saying. They're saying the thing is that eyewitness testimony is inherently unreliable. So, but you can use other evidence to then confirm it. But sometimes you only have eyewitness testimony. But it's always good to use eyewitness testimony to confirm hard evidence. For example, you find a bullet, you find a gun, and then the eyewitness testimony confirms that, oh, that's where the shooting occurred or something. That's the best way to use eyewitness testimony, to use it to confirm hard evidence. Now, but you can also take eyewitness testimony and then look for other evidence to support it. It's not that you can't use it, it's just inherently unreliable. Now, if all you have is eyewitness testimony, then you try to do things like you're doing and look at the nature of the testimony. And then, because if you're in court, the other side is going to cross-examine the witness and see if they can poke holes in their memory, and see how, like Sam Holland. Hold on a second. Sam Holland was interviewed by Tink Thompson for over 5 hours. I mean, they went after him really hard, and he held up. And he was adamant about him seeing smoke where he was, seeing smoke underneath the trees. He went to the spot where he said he thought he saw the shooter, and then Tink Thompson takes a picture across the street, and son of a gun, where Sam is standing, his hat is exactly in the place where the Mary Mormon photo shows a potential assassin. So, he was the kind of guy that wasn't afraid. So there are some people that want to be involved. Howard Brennan, I think to me, he seems like one of those guys that wants to be a big shot. And then he couldn't identify Oswald after Oswald had been on TV. When he goes look at the lineup, he claims he's scared. Well, that was something that the excuse he came up with afterwards. I think the Warren Commission attorney may have suggested that to him. But you can use eyewitness testimony, just that it's always good to try to get confirmatory evidence to support that, or use it to support other evidence.
Well, eyewitness testimony is especially good to use if you're dealing with someone who has war experience, someone that can actually take account as well too when it's in an adrenaline situation like an assassination. I mean, there's obviously things that people aren't going to be remembered because you're more likely panicking and trying to find a way to get out of there. But what I was mentioning was about the people who interview the witnesses, and then they go and talk about it for educational purposes. Not all the witnesses want to go back to that tragic day and relive it. It's hard for them. So we leave it up to the researchers like William Law and all the people I've had on my show, people like yourself as well too, they're trying to do for educational purposes. It's good because you can educate people on a lot of topics that they don't know about, but then it gets discredited by some people on the opposing side as not being real information. And then it gets the public into the discussion of like, I shouldn't learn about it. I should just wait till someone gives me the cliff notes, which I'm sure after, and I saw your interview as well too. I don't remember if it was Tucker Carlson's show that you were on, or was it, his last name was Walsh. That might've been Jim that was on that show. But
Carlson. Jim was on Walters.
And when that happens and you go on a show like that and you start talking about this, the issue when it comes into the public just wants the end. They want the whole story, but they want it in like a Cliff Notes version. The Warren Report was their Cliff Notes version. When those documents got released, you know how many people that I've been following for a very long time that had nothing to do with the assassination that starts going, can somebody break down these 22 released documents for me? And I was like, it's a fucking day past when they released them. Any person worth their salt is not going to go and talk to you about this because they don't know yet, because we have to look through them. And you guys said it on television as well too, as we don't know. It's just been released. We're going to go through these and we're going to take our time with it. But they pressured you right when you were going to do your conference. It was less than a week. And then you had to go and talk about some of the records and things as well too. So, I mean, there's an issue when it comes to like, people want that ending version. And they want an episode that's going to have all of it wrapped up into one. And that's not what you need. What you need is you need to start listening to every single researcher who has done independent work in every single area and explored whatever and talk to whoever, and then listen to them and get educated on the whole thing to actually care about it. I mean, getting my generation in on the discussion, because I would say my generation is probably more activist, more, movement wise when it comes to getting things done. Not saying that the other generations weren't, but mine is really a kind of hectic with it. And it's good because it does get progress going as well too. When you get people in on the discussion and get them to actually care about the assassination rather than what's the story. We all the time now we watch the news expecting someone to say that. And best thing Jim did was when he was on that show and the guy asked him, "What are these documents telling you right now?" And he goes, "I just want more documents." Because he wanted them to say CIA did it. He wanted them to go and run off that way. And then it gets immediately thrown out the window with anybody that either doesn't believe it or people that think conspiracy or any of that type of stuff. Just state
Well,
the facts.
if you go on the air and they ask you who you thought did it, and then you indicate that if someone disagrees with that conclusion, then everything you set up to that point they discount. But the key is you have to look at the quality of the researcher and how they questioned the eyewitness. So there are people, again, they are looking for an outcome. And so they will interview the person in a way to basically get them to confirm the outcome they're hoping for. And it's not a searching interview. So you look at the quality of the interview. Some people, if they're just looking for an outcome, they'll ask kinds of questions also that'll get them to that point. So when you look at the interview in the Warren Commission,
I'm the bottom of the barrel if I'm an interview.
well, but I'm saying that it's a quality. So if you're doing a genuine interview, like as a lawyer, I'm looking at what kinds of questions were asked, what kind of follow-up there was. So for example, when
Breaking.
John McCone and Richard Helms were being interviewed by the Warren Commission about what the CIA knew about Oswald when he was in Russia, the person asking them the question was Alan Dulles. Now, Alan Dulles was asking them questions about things that happened on his watch, and he knew what the answers could be. So not only was the wrong person asked, well, for the Warren Commission purposes, he was doing his job, which is limiting the exposure to the CIA. But when you look at the kinds of questions he was asking leading questions like, well, that would be the State Department would be the responsible for giving that information, right? And that was tipping them off to saying what the answer should be. So only in the Warren Commission, the Seinfeld bizarre world of the Warren Commission, could you have a person asking the interviewee questions about something that occurred on the interviewer's watch, and he knew the answers. I mean, there's no way Alan Dulles should have been asking those questions. He had a huge conflict, but he was allowed to ask those questions. So he never extracted the right kinds of answers from Helms or McCoy, even if they were going to give the right answers. He never did it. So you have to look. Let's assume that if David had, who just passed away, if he was trying to confirm his story about the switching of the bodies, before the surgery, before the autopsy, you look at his questions to see whether he was actually trying to get the answers he wanted, or was he actually asking searching questions. And from what I've seen on a couple of videos that are on YouTube, he was actually looking for information. He wasn't just trying to get the answer that he thought. He was genuinely trying to see, does this guy have information? What is his information? How does it line up? He wasn't just trying to extract facts from him that could be used to support his theory. And that's how you have to look at the quality of how the person is being interviewed, because eyewitnesses are just going to respond to questions. Now, sometimes it's open-ended and they just sort of start, remembering things, but usually it's pointed questions and they just answer the question. So, and that's how lawyers control things, and then in the Warren Commission, they would go off the record. If you kind of do a diagram of many of Spector's interviews, he asks questions that are specific questions. He doesn't explore areas that he doesn't want to be explored. If the witness goes and starts saying things he doesn't want to, explore, he just ignores the answer. And if the person persists, he goes off the record to basically get the person back on track. And that's how you manufacture a record.
Non-JFK related, but based on all your interview experiences that you've had on other people's shows, would you call this an interview or is it a conversation?
It's the conversation.
That's what I'm
Yeah.
going for. I hate the word interview.
You're asking me open-ended questions, and
I want to get your thoughts, man.
yeah, what do you think? What do you know? Now you have specific questions, but you're not like trying to you're not putting guardrails up on the conversation,
Yeah,
right?
tell me what the Powerball numbers
Road
are.
here. I mean, we're going on off ramps.
That's the best part, man. ADHD is a fun little thing if you ride it right. But you mentioned the bill. Can I add a clause in there which makes a lot of the JFK things like can we put something in a bill that can talk about all the JFK material be public domain? There's so many things like 6th Floor Museum. I've talked about this with Randy Benson, claims the rights to the Zapruder film. They don't own the Zapruder film, but they say they do. There's plenty of people that have tried to make documentaries based on conspiracy aspects of things, but they need the documentation and they threaten to be sued or they threaten to have to pay. I got an email request for $15 a second for a 5-minute clip. And I said, for educational purposes. And he was like, that is our educational price. I was like, holy shit. Like, that's a lot of money, man. So
There's no way that the broadcast networks, for example, should be able to take interviews of witnesses to an assassination and try to assert copyright protection. That is a historical document, and that should be pursued.
AP Archives, CNN, all these people that have footage of Jack Ruby getting shot from various, or not Jack Ruby shooting Oswald from various angles. That should not be something you have to go and get a license to get. That should be public domain.
It's about a historical event, and it should be available for free for educational purposes. Now, if you're writing a book and you want to include the footage, I could see that. But if you're just doing an educational, I mean, using the Zapruder film, I had to, when I was on the Kappa board, we had to have a discussion. Can we show the Zapruder film at our conference? Because technically it's copyrighted and people are paying to go see our conference. Then most people, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission. So a lot of times people will just show it. And then if the 6th floor says, hey, sorry, well, I won't do it again,
Baylor University threatened to sue the 6th floor if they try to claim rights on the Zapruder film.
So I think that I don't know. That would be interesting if there may be a constitution, there may be a third part, there may be a taking issue if, and I know the ARP struggled with this. By the way, the government paid a lot of money for the Zapruder film, and they priced it like they based the price on like if JFK's golf clubs had gone to auction, how would they be priced? They priced it as if it was memorabilia, not a historical document. They should have paid. They paid multiple. I think they paid like $10 or $12 million for.
And they sold it back for $1.
But the point is that the government paid like $10 or $12 million for the film. And I think the total R budget may have been like $4 million. So it doesn't make sense. And like,
well, why would you buy it for so much money and then sell it back for $1 is the thing. Like, if you believe it's edited, that's 100% evidence of like, that would be an editing thing. If you were able to cut out a frame and then sell it back, why just $1? It doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't you put it in the archive?
Well, because you need some consideration if you're going to be having a contract. So you mentioned $1. There's some nominal consideration.
No, I get that, but she paid damn near $12 million for the film. I would feel like you would at least $10, get a sandwich or something, not $1.
Well, anyway, so and like Tink Thompson donated his papers to the 6th floor, and I'm like, why would you do the 6th floor, not the archives? Now, maybe he's got questions about the archives, but there are records. We were trying to get. Copies of certain Zapruder films, the blow up prints, and Oh, I think David Mantic went one or two times, and it looked like there was a change in the appearance of one of the slides with the ball out. And so he wanted to go a third time, and they denied access. It's like, how do you deny access? You're here, your institution is to let people have access. That's the whole purpose. So I think we have to rethink about the ARBs had the power to go and subpoena private individuals with assassination records. We know from some of the accounts of Mrs. Lincoln's, she basically auctioned off some of these materials, and private parties took them. I mean, they should be recaptured by the government. So the way, I mean, I would argue that even the autopsy materials, the government never had title to those materials to be able to give them back to the Kennedy family, for which the Kennedy family then imposed conditions. My understanding of the way the law works is that the Maryland County Coroner's Office technically had title to those materials. They're the ones that have ownership of autopsy materials that are done in the county. And therefore, they're the ones that had title. And the government never had the right to give title to Bobby Kennedy, who then his family then posed conditions on. I think that there could be a lawsuit filed there about, does the Kennedy family really have the ability to impose conditions? Did they really have the ability to actually have a deed of gift? Did they actually have title, lawful title? Now, this bill could, in theory, overrule all of those restrictions, even the restrictions of viewing the autopsy materials. I mean, this bill would eliminate the restriction. There's two restrictions under the act. You can't get tax records, and the deed of gifts is exempt as well. So from being released, the bill would eliminate both of those restrictions.
I feel like if you had, there's probably been plenty of people out there that have been trying to make a JFK film before, so it's not necessarily new. But with the conspiracy angle, I feel like you would have more people showing material and putting a lot of these videos up there if it was all more public domain aspects of things as well too. I mean, there is an issue with making money, that people who make a film are making money off it, so obviously they have to pay a certain fee. But also when it comes to like the JFK library is open for you using anything from their whole thing. They said any of the stuff that's been donated to the library, go ahead and use it. 6-4 Museum has not been that friendly. And then the National Archives, I mean, as far as I know, a lot of their documents are public domain for anybody to have or whatever. But there are certain things that are restricted or under certain access.
Try to handle the rifle. Try to handle some of the bullets. So that interview with that doctor who wrote the book, I forget his name off the top of my head. No, not Mantic. One of the Parkland doctors, the one that ended up having to sue.
Humes, Crenshaw.
What? Yeah, Crenshaw. Yeah. So if you want to get his interview, you got to pay like $15 a second or something. I mean, he's giving his observations of the treatment of the president of the United States. How is that copyrighted? Everybody should be able to see that. They shouldn't have to be able to pay NBC. NBC has a broadcast license. The government could say, if you want your broadcast license, here's one of the conditions you have to do. You have to be able to give these documents to whoever wants them for educational purposes.
Yeah, I mean, the AP archive owns a couple of good vast things of footage, even the Hale Boggs interview where he's calling out J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, there's real evidence there if you support, but then it goes into what would be labeled conspiracy that would be involved in the Kennedy assassination. I think that scares them again about how much information or how much things that they could release when it comes to, well, how's a Hale Boggs interview linked into the assassination? I mean, I could do it.
The Warren Commission.
Yeah, but see, that's the thing. And they go, okay, well, if it's not pertinent to the actual assassination, if it's not JFK related, if it's another person, then they can just get another exemption out there. So maybe that's something you can add to your bill. anything that would be related to any Warren Commission members, any testimonies, any footage that comes either.
Well, I think
first,
the bill defines assassination records as defined in the statute, and I think we need to amend that to say as defined by the ARB regulations, because the ARB regulations were very broad, and the ARB being the agency that was authorized by Congress to implement the act, their interpretations are entitled to be given deference and respect by courts. So I think, that's one of the suggestions I have a bunch of suggestions I'm going to make. The bill is a good bill to start with, but the problem is there's no enforcement mechanism in it, because if the agencies don't release the records in 30 days, what do we do? The Department of Justice has to sue them. And is that going to really happen?
Are they going to get anywhere with that?
I mean, is the Department of Justice really going to sue? And then there's there's a lot of complicated things that get into that. But anyway, so that's good news that we have a bill that's now been introduced. It's the first time a bill has been introduced into Congress about the JFK Act since 1994. So this is pretty significant. And the David Schweikert was born in 1962, so he doesn't have any personal knowledge of the president. But I don't know if he has it. I don't know what his interest is. Yeah, people now have already started attacking him because he belongs to some right-wing organizations. But you know what? I don't care what person's political beliefs are. If you're going to work with me on getting the records released, that's all I care about. I find ways of working with people. You find areas you can agree on, and you may have areas you disagree on, but if you work on the areas that you can work on together. And I would suspect a lot of he represents one of the suburbs of one of the cities. I don't know if it's Tucson or Phoenix, but I would presume a lot of his constituents, are retired, and they probably have an interest in the Kennedy assassination. But I'm going to be speaking to his office next week to try to make some recommendations to see, get some more information about it. But the takeaway for your listeners is to look up your congressperson. If they sit on one of those five committees, write your congressman, call them, email them, write them a letter. Your generation doesn't write letters, but basically contact them and ask them to ask the chair to hold a hearing. Now, I was going to ask to have the hearing done during Sunshine Week, but unfortunately, Congress is out during Sunshine Week, which is ironic. We are going to try to hold Mary Farrell. We're going to try to hold some event during Sunshine Week to come up with some, updates and information that we've learned since the release in 2015. I'm sorry, since December 15th of last year.
Well, do you have any links you'd like to promote, Larry? You've given me enough of your time, man.
Not right now, no. And okay. Just so your listeners know, the government in the lawsuit filed a motion to dismiss our lawsuit, which is pretty standard. We knew that was coming. And we have till March 7th to respond to it. And, the government's position, the good news is there's a lot of things are done preliminary in a lawsuit. So you may, defendant can argue that they want a different court. That's called a change in venue. So we filed this action in the Northern District of California. They could have asked to have this moved to DC. They didn't do that. There's another thing that you could argue without getting to the merits of the case, that the plaintiff has no right to be in court. That's called standing. And we thought they were going to make that argument. And as an environmental lawyer, I'm very used to having environmental organizations, bringing an action against a polluter, saying, my members are being affected because you're polluting the river. So I was pretty sure we were bulletproof on standing. And they didn't argue standing. So they're just going right to the heart of the complaint. And they're specifically saying that the court has no jurisdiction to hear President Biden, to evaluate President Biden's decision when it comes to national security. And then they're trying to argue that NARA is not subject to review because they had no obligations under the JFK Act. So we're going to be responding to those arguments. And then the oral argument in the case will be right now is scheduled for the end of April. So we should have a decision on the motion to dismiss. So if we survive the motion to dismiss, the case continues. If we lose, then the court could say we're going to give you a second chance to to amend your complaint, or they may just say we're dismissing your action. So, but that so the government has not filed its answer yet. It just filed a motion to dismiss, which is not unusual. We completely expected that, and we'll see what happens. So we're hoping that the judge will do the right thing and keep us in the case and allow us to move forward.
Well, I appreciate the work that you're doing, and at least fighting for some truth as well too. I'm sure plenty of researchers appreciate that, and hopefully we can get a whole generation, my generation, maybe some other people that might have missed out on specific details of the assassination.
Yeah, again, I want your generation to realize that you guys are in a church commission time right now. What happened in the mid 70s, the early to mid 70s with the church commission, that was a special era. We had lots of activity during that period of time, and then nothing happened. We're in this era again. So to the extent that you guys, with your social media skills, you could mobilize, get word out about the bill, whatever you guys do. I mean, I'm a dinosaur when it comes to, I can do some social media, but the way you guys use TikTok and everything else to just, when you have a political cause, you guys mobilize using social media. We could really use your help, and people that are concerned about this, to use your social media skills to get pressure on Congress to have a hearing. We need to have a hearing. We want these people to be called before Congress, before the American people, and explain in an unclassified way, what are they holding back? Why are they holding back these records? And what about the rest of the records? We want the American people, and especially those of us who lived through this event, we want to know what happened. We want to know why it happened. And we want to know why you're holding back the information. And I think it would be great for my generation to, at least when we go to our, when we pass on, at least we'll know why the most important event in our country happened in our lifetime. So, so I really want to encourage you and mobilize your listeners and viewers. Use your social media skills, get pressure on Congress, get those 5 committees to start moving. And that's just the House. The Senate, the Senate Homeland Committee, which is chaired by Senator Peters from Michigan and Ron Paul from Kentucky, and libertarians are, it's ironic, the era we're in right now, it used to be the Republicans and the conservatives who defended the law enforcement and the intelligence apparatus, and it was the liberals who were fighting them. And now the tables have turned. It is the liberals who are defending the CIA and the FBI and generally intelligence, because they view them as having been heroes when it came to President Trump. They're the ones that pushed back on President Trump. It's the libertarians and the conservatives who are trying to get the truth out in the Kennedy assassination. It's a remarkable turn of events. But Rand Paul is an important person. He's the ranking member in the Senate. But again, go to after you view who your congressperson is and what committees they sit on, go to your senators, 2 senators you have, go to both senators' websites, see what committees they sit on. If they sit on the Homeland Committee, the Judiciary Committee, or the Intelligence Committee, ask them to write their senators, and because we want something in the Senate as well. If the House comes out with a bill, it goes nowhere unless the Senate passes its own bill, and then it goes to the president. So, if we only have hearings, at least that would be helpful, but we want to get a bill. We want this law to be amended to reflect what's happened in the last 30 years.
We'll get to
so again, your homework is not just to listen to what I'm saying, but to do something. So you guys have plenty of skills. I admire your generation and the way you activate and mobilize, and we really need your help in mobilizing to get Congress's attention on this really important matter. Because if you can't release 60-year-old records, how are you going to release classified records from the last administration or the administration before that, right? I mean, 60-year-old records should be the low-hanging fruit. And if you can't get 6-year-old records released, you're not going to find out what your government was doing two years ago. Even there's a 25-year automatic declassification rule, which is more honored than the breach. If you can't get 6-year-old records released, how are you going to get the 25-year-old records automatically released? I mean, this is a really important issue. We need to know what our government's doing.
I'm gonna
You're
link.
entitled to as Americans.
We got a job to do. We know it. We'll mobilize. But
Okay, go out
Larry,
there and do your job.
thank you so much for doing the podcast again, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode about